So hello, welcome, and thank you for being here today. So this seminar is part of ILCE-ACAT's Création, culturelle et territoire axis. And it's the second in a series of seminars entitled Climate Fictions, which aims to explore different types of climate fiction, both in literature and in the visual arts from an Anglophone perspective. And it's organized by myself and James Dalrymple, who is keeping a low profile because he isn't very well, but he is here. So for this second seminar, we will have the pleasure of listening to Nessa Cronin, who will give a talk entitled Climate Fact or Climate Fiction, Exploring the Politics of Hope in Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. So I'll let Marie introduce.
So, thank you also for coming today. And yes, I am very pleased to introduce Nessa Cronin, whom I have known for the past almost 15 years. We counted.
15, not 50.
15. We're not that old. And so Nessa Cronin is a senior assistant professor in Irish Studies at the Centre for Irish Studies, the University of Galway. In the School of Geography, Archaeology and Irish Studies. Her recent work in environmental humanities has critically examined the role of humanities research and arts practice in addressing the urgent challenges revolving around climate change and biodiversity loss in particular, and she has contributed to national government policy in this area. So Nessa has been the recipient of several awards from the Irish Research Council, Culture Ireland and the European Science Foundation. She has held research fellowships in the University of Stanford, University of Oxford, University of Concordia, amongst others, and is at the moment a Gates Senior Research Visiting Fellow at here, Maison de la Création et l'Innovation. And welcome, Nessa, for the third or fourth time already in Grenoble, so you're at home almost.
Thank you. Okay, thank you to both of the Maries, Marie-T and Marie-M. So for the wonderful warm visit, and it's lovely to be back here. I think maybe because it's Galway and Grenoble, the two Gs, I just feel very comfortable. And it's very similar to Galway in some ways, apart from the Alps. But it's they're university towns. There's a really nice sense of what we're doing on the campus has an impact in our communities outside of the campus as well. And that's, I suppose, really what I'm hoping to touch on a little bit today. So to say thank you very much for the invitation to talk on this topic. And it also, I suppose, inspired me to actually read this novel that was sitting on my bedside locker for a long time, Gathering Dust. And so the invitation to speak on this encouraged me to actually put it up on the top of the list to read, and also to kind of start thinking about these things in a little bit more detail. So what I'm hoping to do today, because this is the first kind of time I've really engaged with science fiction and climate fiction, I normally don't go into that realm of literary activity. So I'm setting up today, it's less of a structured finished paper, but more of a series of questions that I hope you will all help me answer. So I'll be crowdsourcing the answers. And thanks in advance to Marie as well for some of her observations that she will bring to the discussion afterwards as well. So it's really set as kind of a series of questions as to what is the function of books like this in society today? How do we read them? How are we to engage with them? And also what do they help us to think about in terms of asking more questions about the big existential questions of our time, which are climate change and biodiversity loss as well too. I'll also be addressing some of these questions, but in a very more practical kind of scenario about teaching climate change and teaching the environment tomorrow. So anyone who wants to come along and see me for, the second performance, I'll be giving a talk here with the Design Factory conference tomorrow at 12:30. So very welcome to come and attend in the amphitheatre as well here. But just to kind of, for those of you that don't know me, which is most of you in the room, so my own background really has been on Irish literature, then more recently into cultural geography, and then in the last number of years looking really seriously at climate change and the ecological crisis. So looking at cultural responses to living in the Anthropocene, both in terms of research and teaching, but also public engagement and working with communities as well. And in Ireland, we have lots of different funding streams from our government down to local levels for artists to work with communities, scientists to work with communities, and academics to work in our local communities as well, under a band of what we call creative climate action. So it's trying to get everyone together, kind of trying to deal with this big, big question as a community as well. The photo in the right-hand corner was me last week, struggling through all these big ideas when I was in Oxford as part of the fellowship. And the other more recent publication that Marie mentioned was my contribution to Ireland's Climate Change Assessment Report, the Irish government, where we had 4 volumes of scientists giving basically a report card to the Irish government. You don't have to read all 4 volumes. The result is it's not good. We can do a lot better. We're doing okay, but we need to accelerate the change. And my own contribution to that is really what is the role of culture in all of this, because many people talk about it as if it's just the science is going to answer the questions, whereas I'm arguing that culture needs to help us bridge the climate action to the climate ambition gap as well. So that's the other part of what I do as well. But I'm going to start with something a little bit different, and it's about kind of something I've been thinking about in recent times, about living in a double time. And this is something that in Ireland we have had a long history of this as a colonial country, having lived in a colonial empirical or empire context of Britain and our neighbour. That in Ireland we lived in double time for many years, up until quite recently, but our double time was the past haunting our present. Now we're living in a different double time. Our future is now haunting our present. And this is something that is very unnerving. It's not just in Ireland. I think all of us experience that at different stages. We're now constantly kind of projecting into the future what our lives are going to look like in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, and then trying to look away at the same time because we don't want to look. It's very, very challenging. For me, this really struck home for me in the summer of 2023 when we had a heat wave in Ireland, but it wasn't a heat wave on the land, it was the heat wave in the sea. So normally I would swim in temperatures of 14 or 15 degrees centigrade, but I was now swimming in temperatures of 19.5. Some people were delighted. They said, this is great. This is a newspaper clip from the newspaper, the Irish News, from the Irish Sun, saying this is hot hopes, it's great, fresh heat waves coming to Ireland. We have a new weather chart revealing a new date for extreme swing of high pressure, and this is seen as a positive thing because we don't usually get very warm summers in Ireland. However, many of us who are sea swimmers were extremely distressed because the jump in sea temperature in the Atlantic, as you can see here, very, very hot, and it was actually gone into this part of the scale just off the west coast of Ireland where I live. So while we were swimming, we were also being equally distressed about swimming in exceptionally warm waters at the time. We're going to come back to India in a moment because that's where the book opens, at a heat wave in India. In India in 2022, there was not just one heat wave, but a whole series of them as well, and various news clips. These are clips here of water being shepherded into different communities along the subcontinent, and obviously very distressing images along with that as well. And then, of course, 23, associated with that swimming event that I talked about, we had the European heat waves that we forget killed nearly 50,000 people across Europe. And this is probably one of the first times that in Europe we began to think that it's coming home to us in this particular way. And we had images here. Often we would have had the images since 2015 of the Mediterranean migrant crisis, but now these were wealthy, white, elite tourists trying to escape Greece. and trying to get off the islands because they were literally being burnt out of where they were. So very, very different shape and colour and demographic that it was being impacted at the time. All of this, it can be very hard to deal with. So what I try to do in my classes as well is always have elements of hope, because it's very easy to fall down to the doom and gloom part of things. And I take hope from the Swiss grannies. These are the grandmothers who took a landmark case against Europe and won earlier this year. It was a climate case arguing that it was a win for all generations, but it was basically, they were arguing that Europe needs to look after women more because women and older women are disproportionately affected in heat waves. They're more likely to die than older men, so there's a gender differential there, but also the age differential as well, in terms of it's the older people are more likely to suffer under heat waves and very young children. And again, we see this being discussed in the novel as well, in the opening section of the novel. So this will be interesting to see how this works and how this kind of unfolds over the coming years. And we'll keep coming back to this idea of language and policy and legislation, which is something that Kim Stanley Robinson is really working through in different ways, with more different levels of success, one could argue, in the novel as well too. The novel itself has many, many themes. But generally, looking at the opening is set in a heatwave in India, and it's set in the near future, so 2025. It was published in 2020, and we'll explore a little bit as to why he sets it in a near future rather than a distant future, which often utopian fiction or science fiction might be more distant in time and place, but he brings it very close, and he centres it in Zurich as well. So lots of references to the Alps as well, which is interesting. There's also references to Galway, which I find interesting in the novel as well too. But it explores the work of a transnational global organisation, a new organisation which is now being called the Ministry for the Future, that has been set up after, this is all fictional, but that was set up after the Paris Climate Agreement to advocate for the rights of future generations. And so it's looking at the idea of the rights of future generations, and people are already doing this in Wales. Actually, at the moment, there's a department for future generations in Wales where they're planning in public policy for the next 15, 20, 50 years. So the policy they make today has an impact on the future generations in Wales as well. The book itself, for any of you who've had the pleasure, one could argue, of ploughing through it. It is long, it is dense, it's over 560 odd pages, built up of over 100 kind of smaller chapters. It touches on everything and anything to do. It's the full toolkit of what we need to think about with the climate crisis. So economics and political economy and theory around that features very strongly, and we'll see in a moment why that is. Policy, public policy, and how public policy is there as kind of a guardrail against private concerns and interests. The role of politics, ecology, science and engineering, and particularly geoengineering projects about changing the template of what the world is doing. And it sets out these different ways in which the future, Europe in particular, as based in Zurich, is going to actually help change the course of the world and take it away from the veering off to the 4 degree of warning and trying to bring the temperature literally down as well. 2 key characters, and this is really the reason why I kind of approached this as well. The key character, the female character, is Mary Murphy, who is the titular head of this Ministry of the Future, and also Frank May, an American aid worker who was severely impacted psychologically. He was a survivor of the Indian heatwave that opens the novel, and it sets him on a particular path afterwards in terms of having post-traumatic stress as well, and sets him on a very particular trajectory. But Mary Murphy, it's a very Irish name, so I had to immediately investigate that. And very quickly I found out that it's modelled on Mary Robinson, who was Ireland's first female president. She was also the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She was a human rights activist and lawyer before she became our president many years ago. And she's now on the Council of Elders with the UN as well, and is still has been very, very active in terms of her climate advocacy and activism, and is still working in that area very, very powerfully as well. There's lots of other Ireland and Irish identifiers throughout the novel, which are also really interesting to me to find and discover. There's references to James Joyce, into Zurich as well, where Joyce is buried and also spent a lot of time. There's references to Swift, to his Jonathan Swift of Gulliver's Travels, who wrote a kind of a pamphlet critiquing the government of the day called A Modest Proposal, saying that, if there was a problem with overpopulation of the Irish, well, the easiest thing to do is to kill and eat the children. So and obviously it was with more than a dose of irony. And there's also references to Beckett as well too. So Kim Stanley Robinson is obviously very well read, and he's coming from a particular perspective. He's had connections to Ireland as well, that I'll talk about in a moment, to the Rallahine Utopian Centre in the University of Limerick, and he's both published interviews with Irish studies scholars over the years as well too. So there's a long connection to Ireland there that it comes through in the novel as well too, which is interesting to see. For those of you that aren't familiar with him, he's the author of over 20 books. The Ministry of the Future and the Mars trilogy being the most well known. And then 2312, which is a New York Times bestseller, was nominated for all 7 of the major science fiction awards, the first for any book. Was published a number of years ago, and was named a hero of the environment by Time magazine. And an asteroid, 72432, was named Kim Robinson in his honour as well. So his big thing is that he's a big fan of NASA and space science, and he says that space science is Earth science. So he's kind of looking again at that interconnection in different ways. But what's also interesting for us as literature people as well, and humanities scholars, is that he completed his BA and his MA in the 1970s, but he went on to earn a PhD in 1982 from UC San Diego, and his original supervisor was the great postmodern theorist who recently passed away, Frederick Jemison. So we'll come back to Jemison again, who's kind of a key figure, and interestingly enough, he dedicates the novel to Frederick Jemison as well, and there's a key reference to Jemison's ideas in the novel that we'll come to explore a little bit in a moment as well. His own dissertation was on the novels of Philip K. Dick, so again looking at kind of science and speculative fiction. It was published a number of years later as well. So he has kind of the scholarly apparatus, which he carries in the novel here, and also the science as well that he's interested in. And I suppose that all kind of comes together in this book in particular. So the novel itself is an exploration of a near future, and that idea of a near future rather than a distant future is something that's really important, because it allows us to kind of critically imagine the Zurich of 2025, and also critically imagine the Ireland of 2025, and also the different other places that he mentions: India, the Basque Country, Spain, France, Italy, and Antarctica as well too. In an interview with Derek O'Keefe in The Jacobin in 2020, Derek O'Keefe opens the interview by saying that the novel is a speculative history of the next few decades, and that it revolves around an international ministry assembled to help implement the Paris Climate Agreement, that the action spans the globe, featuring popular uprisings, eco-terrorism, asymmetrical warfare, student death strikes, and geoengineering. So it's covering a lot of ground, theoretically and geographically as well too. But what Robinson talks about as well in other interviews is that for him it's an exploration of what a post-capitalist society might look like, or what it might be. And he doesn't have a name for that, but he says it's something that capitalism is bringing us to this point that is not great. And we might need to think of other ways of being and living in the world and organising the world, but we don't have a vocabulary for that yet. So the best thing he can come up with is post-capitalism. He doesn't have a name for what that might be as yet. And what the novel does is that it explores what scientists talk about, tipping points. So when we hear about tipping points and climate change, it's things like either the air temperature or the carbon or particulate matter in the air. But here he's looking at social tipping points and political tipping points in a different way, and that might tip things in a different direction. One element of this is the group in the novel that are called the Children of Cali, and they are an eco-terrorist clandestine movement. One could argue they're loosely modelled on kind of an earlier kind of incarnation of what Greenpeace actions were in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, and more recently Extinction Rebellion, civil disobedience and interventions from 2018 to the present. Children of Cali are more extreme. In the novel, what they do is they take out airlines that are flying, commercial airlines that are flying for particular companies to stop people flying and to move airlines that are reliant on a particular carbon economy and fossil fuels to electric transportation. They also take out other forms of transport, and this is seen in different ways in the novel. There's pros and cons, obviously, for all of that as well, that is explored in the novel itself. So it does bring up these kinds of questions of where and how society moves, what levers people feel they have to pull to enact dramatic change, and what are the ethics of those kinds of actions as well too. The central part of the novel, however, is really focusing on legislation, policy, and also political economy. So the big kind of shifting tipping point in a way is the introduction of what is called the carbon coin, a new form of capital and a new form of exchange to develop an alternative economic model. And with that brings carbon quantitative easing. There's lots of discussion about this in the novel, that can be quite painful for those of us that aren't economists. So you can be forgiven quite easily for skipping over those parts in those chapters. But basically it's about carbon sequestration schemes, which are something that's already happening, about trying to keep the carbon in the ground, keeping the fossil fuels in the ground, and lots of discussion about coal and oil being worth more in the ground than out of it, so that it's in companies' interests to keep it there because they're going to be paid to do so, and communities and nations as well. Two other elements to the novel as well that are of interest is the question of geoengineering. And again, that's quite a controversial topic in many ways. Some people argue this is what we need to do. Other people argue we won't know. These are big risks. We don't know what the impact of geoengineering will be. So there's two different kinds of geoengineering projects happen in the novel. The first one is particulate matter is sprayed into the air in India after the heat wave to bring the temperature down for 3 to 4 years afterwards and to prevent any future heat waves. They don't know if it's going to work. It does, but they don't know what the impact will be in terms of monsoon and weather, and also will these particulates move to the other parts of the globe as well. So it's really an experiment that they're trying. The second one that's kind of being road tested is geoengineering water and ice in the Antarctic. And this is the one that he says that he didn't know whether it would work or it wouldn't work, but he kind of postulates this as a possible way of slowing down the Antarctic ice glacial melt and just slowing down the oceans rising as well too. So lots of things that are based in science now, but also speculative science and postulating different ways of possibly thinking about things from an economic perspective as well. Just a few things here then as well. What's really of interest, and again, this is about the near future and why he chooses to keep it in the near future. The places in the novel feel very real. There's a big discussion about Davos, the big party zone for the tech bros, and also Zurich, Antarctica, Kerala, the Basque Country, Ireland. There's references to rain in Galway, which is absolutely accurate. And you do get a sense in the novel that these are real places and these are real societies. This is not something that's kind of make-believe in World of Warcraft or something else in a different, distant territory, or in Mars on a different planet entirely. He also experiments with different subjectivities, and so the different chapters in the novel it can be first person singular, it can be third person singular, but he also moves from different perspectives and different protagonists. So we have the protagonist, the character of Mary Murphy, then we have the character, the American NGO worker. And then we get the perspectives then of people who become climate refugees that might not immediately have struck those for people maybe in the West in particular, or the global North. So medical doctors living in conditions now under pressure, now becoming climate refugees and trying to struggle to get their families onto a lifeboat. And the main characters again, Frank May and Mary Murphy as central characters throughout. He also brings in, interestingly, and with different degrees of success, I think, probably from a literary perspective, non-human subjectivities. So we have the eye of the sun, the eye of light, the eye of energy, and the eye of photons in the novel. So again, experimenting with this kind of post-humanist kind of way of thinking, and trying to imagine kind of in a different way, a kind of a post-anthropogenic way as well, as to questions of agency. Who are the actors of agency on our planet? And it's not just us. We are interacting with other kind of actor networks out there as well. And the biosphere, of course, is one of the big actors in the novel that he explores. I won't have time to go into this today, but this is something I would like to explore further as I kind of go into this a little bit more detail over the coming months, is that he has mentioned this idea of structures of feeling in several interviews about the novel. And those of you who are literary scholars and theorists will recognise this phrase from the great theorist Raymond Williams. And what Kimley Stanley Robinson, I think, is kind of posing here is that we're now living in a new era, and that the old structures of feeling of the 20th century or the post-Enlightenment period are not really fit for purpose. There's this tension in having a traditional way of looking at the world and our place in it, whether it's that nature-society divide that has created arguably a lot of this tension. And he's thinking we're now living with new structures of feeling, but we yet don't really have a full vocabulary for that. And he keeps coming up with this as a way of just posing that question, but he's saying, I don't yet have the answer, but I recognise this is different. This feels different. The structure of what we have is different. The society is different. The climate, the planet is different. And our future will be different as well. So that's something I would like to explore further as well. If anyone has suggestions on that, I'd be very grateful as well. In a recent interview this summer with the LSE Review of Books, he says that history is now planetary. So history no longer just the purview of the human, but it's planetary. The biosphere is a character in our lives. So this again goes back to that non-human subjectivity. In our actor network, science fiction allows you to write about that as a natural part of the narrative. And for him, science fiction is the reality in which we are inhabiting today. That's his own personal perspective there. So the question then is, and again, I'm not a Cli-Fi scholar, I'm coming to this from kind of a different perspective, but it does bring up all of these kinds of questions for me, which are really interesting, as to what is the role of Cli-Fi, of climate fiction, and what are its connections to a longer tradition of utopian literature, science fiction and speculative fiction as well, and how maybe this book is kind of a blend of all of those different genres. Stanley Robinson has read all of this literature. He's very well versed in it. He's done his primary source reading, as we would say to our students. He's done his secondary source reading, and he has kind of tested some of these theories as well. So he knows what he's doing in the novel for sure. So how I see how it operates here is that it allows us to connect to past and existing writings on literature and the environment. So you could read this through the lens of Thomas More's Utopia. You could read it through Margaret Atwood as well in different ways, and looking at a dystopian kind of fiction as well, with The Handmaid's Tale and the question of gender and power in particular. And it's not an accident that the key character, the key protagonist here is a woman as well, and being modelled in Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson famously said that climate change is a man-made problem, but with a feminist solution. But men can be feminists too. So I think that's really interesting to see how he interconnects all of these things here. But I suppose for us as scholars as well and as educators, what can we learn from these kinds of texts? What are the positive and negative aspects of these? Is it successful? Are there parts of it that maybe might not be as successful, maybe in other ways? What can this genre bring to our critical imaginations that other genres or forms of writing can't? So, for example, if he was to write a realist novel set today, would it be as successful, or would it prompt us to think about things in a different way? Or does this do this better, is kind of the question. What do these sci-fi novels do? And some scholars argue that they help us to rehearse future scenarios. So it's kind of a future drill of if there is this massive catastrophic heat wave, or there's this massive catastrophic event in one part of the world, would it propel everyone finally to come together to make an international agreement? We have the COPs going on at the moment, different levels of agreement and not agreement there, different levels of movement. So it's kind of working in and through, and there's references to the COPs in this as well too. Different ways of thinking about that. What's interesting though with this kind of novel, because it's the near future, it allows us to be present now, jumping a little bit future so we can still imagine it, but then work backwards then from the future to our present, and to kind of ask us to critically reimagine, and one could argue reverse engineer our present to ensure we're now on a different path. So we have to jump forward, to jump back, to move into a different future. It's kind of, I think, what he's asking us to do. And of course, literature is the perfect tool to allow us to do this. Art and culture is, again, the perfect tool. Literature, because it deals with language and discourse, and it asks us to really focus on how language might mask things or mask truth or realities. So with disinformation, with politics, with economics, what is it really telling us? What is it hiding? So I think that literature has a very particularly important role in that as well too. And of course, we have to read, we have to decipher, we have to interpret, we have to critique and understand what's going on in the world, to then develop new vocabularies for this new structure of feeling, for this new epoch that we're living in, the age of the Anthropocene, or however you want to frame it. Most importantly, and this is where I'm going to finish up with the kind of the exploration today, is this book and other books similar to this, and also other kinds of artworks generally, really remind us that there's always an alternative future. And I think that's probably the most important lesson for me. And that's something that's really, really important to remind ourselves, but also our students when we're teaching, that there are other possible ways and other possible futures there. And art and literature can give us a vista into different kinds of futures as well as other disciplines as well too. And here, this is where we're going to shift a little bit back to Frederick Jameson, because Jameson, in a very famous essay called Future City that we'll have a look at in a moment, talks about that we can't just look at the singularity of history with a capital H that will determine our future with a capital F. That's always posed within a particular limited logic of late capitalism. There's issues in the way that Jameson frames that in 2003 that 20 years later wouldn't really 100%, I suppose, map onto our reality, but still it's an important point to kind of to focus on here. So let's go back to this interview with Derek O'Keefe in The Jacobin. And really what Robinson is saying here in this interview is about that to have a radical break of one structure of feeling, or a radical break of one society into a post-capitalist society, he feels if he was to write a novel on that, it wouldn't work. So what he had to do was to try to talk about what are the steps that we need to go to get there. And I just had these two different images here. The first one is kind of that we know what the target is to get to the steps. But I think actually his book is actually about the second one. We don't know exactly where we're going to go, but we need to get somewhere other than where we are now. But we're not quite sure what that is.
And also, I think there will be steps down.
Steps down and backwards. Yeah. Exactly. Which is a really, really good point. Absolutely. So he says here in this interview, I don't think it's possible to postulate a breakdown or a revolution to an entirely different system that would work without mass disruption and perhaps blowback failures. So it's better to try to imagine a stepwise progression from what we've got now to a better system. And the book talks about going forwards, but also going back, and also things that didn't work, and also different parts of the world where the stepwise went sideways or backwards, and then eventually had to be pulled into the future again. And he says by the time we're done, and I mean, he says, done is the wrong word, but by the end of the century, we might have, again, he's postulating in that speculative fiction way, a radically different system to the one we've got now. And this is kind of necessary if we're going to survive without disaster. So since it's necessary, it might happen. And I'm always looking for the plausible models that already exist and imagining that they get ramped up. And it's looking at these plausible models that he's kind of teasing out, and, on all of the different kinds of models and scenarios he's exploring, he's trying to figure out that kind of stepwise back and forth and backwards, as you were saying, but not quite sure exactly where we're going to end up, but hopefully in a better scenario to where it would be if it was just on a linear kind of model. And then he says, can you morph by stages from the political economy that we're in now and beyond that to a post-capitalist system that might be a completely new invention that we don't have a name for? And then finally he says this has to be fought at the level of the discourse battle, and no concessions can be made on that point. Now the scientists in the room will just yawn at that point, and the economists will no, but science is about language. Economics is written in language, whether it's the language of maths or the language of English or French or Italian or Arabic. So again, how we tell the story of this is really important. Frederick Jameson, in the Future City article, he talks about this a lot in terms of rethinking history and rethinking alternative futures. I won't go into it in too much detail here, but what he's saying here is, he says, but I think it would be better to characterise all of this in terms of history, a history that we cannot imagine except as ending, and whose future seems to be nothing but a monotonous repetition of what is already here. So this is looking at one vision of history, that we're on a particular path and this is where we're going. And he says, but the problem is then how to locate radical difference, how to jumpstart the sense of history with a small h, so that it begins again to transmit feeble signals of time, of otherness, of change, of utopia. And it's about breaking out of a particular logic that we've been swept into, to move adjacent to that. If we can't move outside it, maybe move to the side, and to think about things a little bit differently. And he says that he thinks that writing is a way of doing that, or at least of trying to do it. So for Jameson, writing and language is a way, and I suppose philosophy and thinking about these things is a way towards thinking about these alternative paths, to think of an alternative future. The one writer he doesn't mention in this article is Walter Benjamin, but Walter Benjamin is everywhere in Jameson. And of course, his thesis on the philosophy of history, it's inspired by Paul Klee's very famous image of the Angelus Novus, the angel of the angel of history that faces forward but also faces back. And Walter Benjamin is thinking about, can we think of a different future? This is, of course, in the period of the 1930s and 1940s, and as a Jew in that time, he was really radically looking for a different future that unfortunately didn't arrive for him. Jameson explores this further. I won't go into that here. But what I want to flip to, and then we will be finishing up very shortly, is this idea of how to be a worthy ancestor and how to plan now for the future, but also being connected to your past. And this is something that is very prevalent in the novel, about having a responsibility to our history and to our cultures, plural, and using that to think about our future in a particular way. Someone who's written about this here is Kenneth MacLeod in a wonderful short article I would encourage everyone to read called Learning to Think Like a Planet. He's an Australian, a social scientist, and he talks about this idea of what is your 1,000-year plan. It's not what's your 5-year goal, what's your 1-year goal, but what's your 1,000-year plan. And it's the idea of how to be a worthy ancestor for the generations to come. What he's doing is he's leaning on a concept that many of you might be familiar with here of cathedral thinking, and the idea that people built structures in the past for future generations to enjoy. So a cathedral would take generations to build in a way. And someone that I teach to my undergraduate classes is Greta Thunberg, who spoke on cathedral thinking and the need for cathedral thinking in terms of climate change to the European Parliament in April 2019. And I just checked it. She spoke about this on the 16th of April, and that was the day after the Notre Dame Cathedral had been on fire. So it was in a very real sense of what it means to rebuild an old edifice, but build it new for a new generation, but building on history and heritage at the same time. This idea of cathedral thinking is not just a European idea or a Eurocentric idea. We have other cultures that have been thinking like this, and most famously it's the 7th generation principle, and this is also mentioned in the novel as well. So I think Kim Stanley Robinson could have written about 5 PhDs probably from the research he was doing for this book. And generally, the 7th generation principle is from the First Nations communities in the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois communities in North America. And it's the idea is that the decisions we make today have to be made as a result of making a sustainable world 7 generations in the future. So everything from policy, from planning to healthcare, to water, to provision, to education, has to be decided on what will the impact be in 7 generations' time. And he talks about this in the novel in different sections. And this is one of the sections where, again, there's different protagonists and different voices coming together from all over the world, talking about the work that they're doing to create a different planet and a different environment. We are all here together to share what we are doing, to see each other and to tell you our stories. We are already out there working hard everywhere around this earth. Healing the earth is our sacred work, our duty to the 7 generations. So that's his acknowledgement there. There are many more projects like ours already in existence. Look us up in your Urlock account. This is a whole new social media platform that has now taken over the realm away from the Twitter sphere and Facebook and the privatization of the kind of the techno platforms, and many support us. Maybe join us now. You will find us out there already now, and then you must also realise that we are only about 1% of all of the projects out there doing good things. And this idea of doing good things is a core element of the novel. That's how we will keep hope into the future, by action and also learning in solidarity with communities across the globe as well. So we're on the final straight, you'll be happy to hear. So 2 books thinking about hope in dark times that I've been kind of working with and thinking through. One is the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. Many of you may be familiar with his work. His recent book, which says it's published in 2025, but I got a copy of it last week. There you go. So this is the future and the present. And it's very interesting. It's a series of essays dealing with the contemporary moment right now, and going against this idea of what progress is, but maybe having to rethink what is progress. If progress has brought us to where we are now, which is climate collapse, maybe we need to rethink what progress is. That's basically his argument, so you've saved yourself reading the book. But the editor's note I thought was really interesting, and so I thought it was worth putting up here. They say that living in a world in which new possibilities for annihilation seem to be proliferating. This is obviously the cheery seminar that everyone wants to come to. Global conflict, the confirmed climate crisis leading to ecological collapse, the rise of the far right and the crumbling of many of the pillars of the liberal social democratic order that we took for granted. Progress seems in some ways a quaint concept to seize upon. And I suppose particularly from between the migrant crisis from 2015 in Europe to the war in Ukraine, to now the war in Gaza, the ecological disasters that are there, and all of these things. This is all coming down very fast. And Trump's election and all of that. And Ireland, we're going to go to the polls in the next couple of weeks. France, you've already been through that as well in June, and I was here to experience that as well. There is pressure on this term of progress now, and I know talking to my students, they have a very different view of what progress in the future is as well. So they continue, a word redolent of Victorian reformers, Ernest Fabians and 1950 Imagineers, envisioning a bright and a shining future. It seems at first glance an odd preoccupation for times in which all we can know for certain is that tomorrow will not be like today. And that's kind of the most difficult thing to kind of deal with, is that the tomorrow is not going to be like today. So then how do we imagine that, or how do we deal with that is the challenge in a way. So Slavoj Žižek, at the end of his book, makes a reference to another Slovenian philosopher called Alenka Zupančič. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her second name, but her book Disavowal, which I've only just started to read, is kind of extraordinary, actually. And it really is about the process of the distinction that she makes between optimism and hope. Mm-hmm. Optimism is thinking that things will get better, but you're in the same system. Whereas hope is acknowledging the system that you're in and working towards making it different. I think that's kind of... and she calls this the politics of disavowal. So it's a rejection of one system to move into something else. And she's exploring... And again, it's about keeping the space of possibility open. Žižek works with this in his essays, and he says that the most difficult ethical task is thus to unlearn the most basic coordinates of our immersion into our life world, that what once served as a recourse to wisdom, the basic trust in the background coordinates of our world, is now the source of mortal danger. In other words, the logic of the Enlightenment has brought us to the brink of extinction. So we need to move and unlearn that in a different way. And the unlearning as well, there's a whole other element of this with Hannah Arendt that I think we could look at as well, which would be really interesting to explore as well too. Instead of saying the future is still fluid, we still have time to act and prevent the worst, one should accept the catastrophe as inevitable and then act to undo the destiny which is already written in the stars. So again, jumping to the future to say this is where it's going to go, but then we need to come back to reverse engineer it to move. So again, kind of in a way what maybe the book is asking us to think about. And he says then, ominous signs are already emerging, but these signs are ambiguous. Their meaning comes from the imaged or predestined catastrophe, and it is in our power to rewrite the past that leads to this future. And again, what Žižek keeps coming back to, and others who have been looking at this in a way, is the power of language, the power of discourse, to keep that space of possibility open, to reject a particular singular narrative, and to keep the space of hope in the future. Final slide. The one person I keep coming back to for this is the American writer, Rebecca Solnit, who is wonderful and has written extraordinarily well about all of these challenges since the early 2000s, about women and gender, living in America under Trump, all of these different challenges, and most critically about the climate and ecological crises as well too. And her book, Hope in the Dark, published in 2005 and written kind of in the backdrop of kind of wars in the Middle East, really has, I suppose, very strong resonances today. And I think I would encourage everyone to, it's a short book, but if you need hope in the dark, this would be the one on your Christmas card list for Santa Claus to bring to make 2025 a little bit better. So she says changing the story isn't enough in itself. And again, this idea of narrative and storytelling being really important, but it's often been foundational to real changes. Making an injury visible in public is often the first step in remedying it. And political change often follows culture, as what was long tolerated is seen to be intolerable, or what was overlooked becomes obvious. And later with that, she talks about whether it was the Me Too movement, whether it's Black Lives Matters, or even thinking about radical change that happened, the divine right of kings, and then the shift to democracy and a republic, slavery and emancipation, women getting the vote. Like, dramatic change can happen, but it's hard when we're in the middle of it to imagine it could, in a way. Which means that every conflict is in part a battle over the story we tell, or who tells and who is heard. So again, that power and narrative is so important here. And then interesting, she said, uncertainty is the space of hope. So if we're living in uncertain times, we could reframe it as a positive, actually, that it's not fully determined yet. And she kind of continues, I want to propose a new vision of how change happens. I want to start over with an imagination adequate to the possibilities and the strangeness and the dangers on this earth in this moment. And then finally, in her opening essay, she says, to hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the past or the present inhabitable. So thinking of that makes the present today all the easier to inhabit. So that's where the ideas are at the moment. I know there's a lot there in that, but kind of I'm just starting to work through some of these thoughts. So I'd be very grateful for comments and suggestions. And so I think Marie is going to lead some of the suggestions there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nessa.
Okay, so I'm just going to introduce Marie who will be acting as respondent today for Nessa. So Marie Mianowski is Professor of Irish Studies and Anglophone Literature at Grenoble Alpes University. She is the author of Post-Celtic Tiger Landscapes in Irish Fiction, 2017, and numerous articles on contemporary Irish literature, representations of place and landscape, and issues of migration and hospitality in contemporary literature and the arts. With Valérie Morrison, she co-leads the Seeds, Sensory Ecologies and Environmental Dialogues in Ireland, IRGA IDEX project, as well as the Irish Ecology section of the GIS-R, which focuses on the convergence between artistic practices and representations, and the ecological practices of gardening and agriculture in Ireland in the context of climate change. So I'd like to thank her again for having accepted to be the respondent today. And while I'm thanking people, I also wanted to thank the Gates project team. So I don't know if there are a few people who are here today for having enabled this seminar to happen by all their work in bringing people like Nessa to Grenoble. So thanks for being here and thanks for all your work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marie. I have a few remarks that I prepared, and then it kind of evolved listening to you, and then a few questions but I'm not going to talk on my own. So if you have questions afterwards, then of course you can ask them. You're very welcome to ask them. I had just really two comments to make. The first one is that because your last word was inhabitable, and it made me think of the conference that Marie and Carole Vaughan-Taylor organized in September, which was called Uninhabitability, Inhabitabilité. And during that conference, there was a debate on the first day, if I remember well. I don't know if you were there, Camille, on the first day, but between well, it was close to an argument, really, between people who were saying that, transition was just, an excuse for doing nothing, and that it was a revolution that was needed to make things actually, for things to actually change. And I think that is something that is discussed in this novel at the beginning, at least. And I think it's very, very important, this idea of the two clubs or two. It's not political parties. It's just people who have different ideas of how to start making a change. And I think it is crucial in that novel because it also raises questions as to democracy. To at what point does transition turn into revolution, and at what point does it cease to be democratic? Or, in other words, how can we keep society, the way that society works, being democratic while, changing gear and kind of accelerating the type of action. So I was very interested by your steps. And I think that it's something that fiction can do, kind of throw us into a world in which those steps are actually made, to imagine how it could actually happen in real life. I wish everybody at that conference read that book, and I really think that it should be read because the question of democracy is central also to that to that novel. So that's something that I'm throwing to you guys. If you read the novel and think about this in particular, as Marie described, I work in Irish Studies, and I have been looking for a novel on hope in Irish fiction for quite a while, and not finding it. And so I was very happy to read American fiction and find a little bit of hope. And I was wondering, so that's one of my questions, but I will ask it properly in a few moments. I was wondering why there is no novel, no fiction really on hope in Irish literature at the moment, and not that many in the rest of literature. I mean, we have a lot of autofiction about here and now in French literature, in Irish literature. There's a lot of how, focusing very closely on what is happening, a leaf falling, a raindrop, and then you can have 3 pages on said raindrop. And I mean, it is interesting, but it's not what I'm looking for, and this comes closer to what I'm looking for. So one of my questions, what I'm going to tell it right now, but then you can answer later, is why do you think there's nothing close to hopeful fiction in Ireland? And do you agree? I mean, I feel it's coming close. I mean, it's coming soon. I have this, but it's more intuitive than kind of really. I mean, I don't have any proof of that, any evidence of that. And so that my second point. The first is therefore on those ideas of transition, revolution, democracy, and the second point is on hope. And I was very interested by what you said about optimism and hope, because it made me think of Corinne Pelluchon. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's a French philosopher, and I came across her work through Constanza Rappa, who's one of my PhD students who's not here today because she's in Galway.
With my PhD students.
Not with Nessa, because Nessa is here, but it's what's good with what's great with PhD students is that they give you new material to read and to discover. And this is what I wanted to show you, because in French we have espoir, but we also have espérance, which is a little bit different. So we have optimisme, espoir, espérance, and Corinne Pelluchon wrote a book on espérance. And so I have tried to kind of translate what she meant. Let me show you. And so I'm just going to present to her the last 2 books, really, because I think they resonate with that novel. I wanted to say something else. What is it? Yes, she has not been translated into English. I checked that again today. There are translations into German, in Italian, Spanish, but not English. And that is maybe why the Slovenian philosopher had this space for her to develop also this discussion between optimism and hope. However, there are a number of scholarly papers in English on her work by other scholars. So if you want to learn about her without reading it in French, then it is possible. So I'll just click on it. So this is her first book, entitled L'Espérance ou la traversée de l'impossible, which was published last year, 2023, and the latest was published this year. So, I mean, she's extremely productive. And this is what she means. The current ecological and political risks explain the climate of anxiety in which we live. While highlighting the destructive dynamics of despair, Corinne Pelluchon shows that confronting the possibility of the collapse of our civilization is paradoxically an opportunity for change that opens up a horizon of hope. By hope here, she meant hope, espérance. This presupposes an understanding that hope, espérance, has nothing to do with optimism, which masks the seriousness of the situation, and that it is also distinct from hope, espoir, which expresses the wish to see personal desires fulfilled. So that's how she distinguishes it. Espoir, it's just, well, I hope everything is fine. You know, that's my personal hope, my personal desire. As opposed to denial, hope, espérance, implies putting the negative to the test. It is a journey through what seems impossible, born without our having looked for it. And when we have lost all pride and illusion, hope, espérance is the ability to decipher in the world around the signs of possible progress, so the word is there, and to transmit the energy needed to make it happen. So hope, espérance is not centered on one's own hopes, but it's centered on what is. So that's why maybe the Irish novel on hope is coming soon, because at the moment it is centered on what is around the non-human, the human, but it's decentering itself gradually, but then the prerequisite to espérance is that once you've deciphered your environment, you need to act. You need to, and espérance as opposed to espoir is going to drive you into action. So that's, I think it's worth reading as an exploration of something that is not negative and something that is not despair. And her latest book is called L'être et la mère, sea, not the mother, pour un existentialisme écologique. So it was just published, and I've included on the slide various places where you can listen to interviews by Corinne Pelluchon. And again, I read with a kind of summary when emphasizing the key elements, I think, of her thought, because you were saying that, and it's true, in this novel you have several chapters in which the son says I, various non-human elements express themselves in the first person, which corresponds to adopting for the reader the viewpoint of a non-human element, and this is exactly what she is saying with the sea. While emphasizing the relevance of existentialism, which implies accepting the facticity of our condition and sheds light on the link between contingency and freedom, indeterminacy meaning and responsibility, Corinne Pelluchon shows that ecology demands that it be enriched. So the old version of existentialism, it's a little bit what you were saying also about past philosophy. But ecological existentialism cannot be reduced to co-existentialism, attesting to the fact that we belong to a community of living beings. It requires us to distance ourselves from the terrestrial imaginary and to think about the human being from the point of view of the sea. Based on a liquid ontology, this existentialism breaks with the territorial obsession that explains the contradictions in international law of the sea, torn between the imperative of preserving an ecosystem essential to our survival and the economic and military rivalries that lead to its over-exploitation. This phenomenology of marine life, which is opposed to any notion of rootedness, highlights the fluidity of the self and sees us as immersed in the shared world, which refers back to memory and the immemorial, to the mother sea this time, and its precedence over the land. So, I mean, there's plenty to explore in these two books, but they resonate with everything that you said, I think, about also looking at the future to be able to look back to the present and then reprocess everything and put into action another form of projection and hope, espérance, in this case. So these were my two comments on democracy, transition, revolution, democracy, and on the other hand, what hope means, and in order for it to be really a source of action. And so here are my questions, which are quite specific, in fact, because you can see on the book cover that it's one of Barack Obama's favorite books of the year. So I was wondering what you think, in fact, I mean, what role do those books have for the people who govern us? I mean, how are we going to force them to read them? You know, no, I'm just joking. But I mean, that's one of my questions. Wait, I'm lost in my notes. So, do you have any explanations or any ideas, or maybe any of you here, as to why there are no more works of imagination, whether novels, films, works of art, trying to imagine possible livable futures? I mean, it seems to be that catastrophe is probably selling better, but okay, do we lack the words still? That's one question. Also, a very Irish question for you, Nessa, because you said that Mary Murphy was kind of modelled on Mary Robinson, and I wondered why, you know, why this American author chose an Irish woman. A woman, okay, I understand. Why an Irish woman? Irish. Would if he had chosen a man, would it have been an Irish man, do you think?
I think probably the timing of that, he was obviously working on this prior to 2020, so in that period, and he had been visiting Ireland to the Rallahine Centre for the Utopian Studies. So, and I think the positionality of Ireland and kind of the Irish history within a European context as being, you know, a small island nation off of the west coast of Europe, but having a colonial past. So Mary Murphy in the novel is a character who is seen as an honest broker with the global north and global south. So she hasn't been part of empire, or hasn't been part of the countries who have arguably destroyed the planet. She's been adjacent to that, so she's also seen as somebody who isn't a technocrat, is not a scientist, she's a diplomat, and that her position is she listens to everybody in the room, but she makes them sit down and thrash ideas out as well. There is arguably a little bit of stereotyping in the novel, a little bit about what the Irish are. At times, it veers a little bit, maybe a little bit that might be seen as a stereotype at times. But I think that Ireland is seen as a neutral country as well, and our own particular history, that it was kind of convenient as well, but it's also a nation state within Europe, so it's kind of a country within a Eurocentric model that's kind of challenging it from within, I think. Mary Robinson is there, and also the other figure is Cristina Figueres, who is one of the key figures behind the Sustainable Development Goals and the origins of that as a concept in sustainability. And I think that the character of Mary Murphy is a composite of those two women, and maybe other individuals as well that I'm not aware of. So it is interesting to me, and I suppose that Mary Robinson as a figure had a very kind of a global presence as well, and she was constantly in the news at different stages over the last 20 years on the front line of climate, and also in terms of gender rights as well, for women and girls around the world. So that might be kind of some reason for that. In terms of the question about the role of books, yeah, they need to read more, you know. But also thinking about Ireland, and I think that idea of a double present in Ireland, I think Irish writers are still locked in the double present of the past. And I think we're just coming to terms with our past in Ireland now. So we haven't really, I think the majority of writers are still locked in that past present double present, not in the future present double present, where maybe some writers are going. And I think that writers, particularly novelists, and the role of the novel, the genre of the novel is a very particular genre that takes time to develop. So possibly one would see it in other genres. I would see hopeful work coming through poetry, actually. So I think of Deireadh Ní Ghríofa, and also Paula Meehan's work, I think, as well. And Moya Cannon that you've been looking at as well too. So I think again really, and the late Derek Mahon, actually, his last book before he died celebrates the ecological vision of Bjork, and it's a wonderful book as well to read. So I think maybe poetry and I'd be more familiar with that realm as well in terms of genre, I think. And also actually children's literature as well. There's a lot of really interesting children's books coming out, and having to put a page of hope at the very end for 7-year-olds is very important. This is heavy stuff, you know. It's difficult to teach and difficult to read and difficult to think about. So there are some really interesting children's writers dealing with this as well, and young adult fiction, I think, as well. So other genres, I think, rather than the traditional genres, which brings in that question of the new structure of feeling as well, and pushing it. And both Dernia Grifa and Paula Meehan have worked with digital born poetry to look at these questions. So moving the genre away from the printed word into digital born poetry. So poetry is meant to be born on the internet and viewed from your phone as well. So which is interesting. So that'd be my general kind of ideas on that as well too.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable reading. I mean, I really encourage you to read it, because I mean the positive ending. I mean, it stayed with me several days, really, you know, trying to, it really brings hope, I think, because it seems feasible. It's not impossible to imagine that, you know, collectively we could could go in that direction. So, I don't know, I hope it's a prophetic novel in a way, which I mean, its main message is it gets worse before it gets better, but because it starts in 2025, it's not a better that is unreachable. So that makes it prophetic.
And just as you were saying about Corinne Peluchon and her idea of hope and the future, in I think Slavoj Žižek's book as well, he talks about the distinction it's in French and in German as well, of futur and avenir, and the idea of a particular kind of future, but also the avenir of becoming, of a future becoming as well, which I think is really interesting. So one could argue that being stuck in an Anglophone vision is quite limiting, and that we need to encompass the different vocabularies that we have at our disposal.
And translate philosophers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if any of you has questions. Yes, please, Libby.
There's a microphone.
Yes, we have to.
Thank you. My question's more political than I'm specialising in British politics, particularly on the rise of the far right, and I do find it hard to find hope sometimes in that looking at that situation. And I don't know enough about Irish politics, but before I ask my question, is the Green Party is in coalition with the two
other main parties in Ireland at the moment, for the next week anyway.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, as our Green Party is nowhere near getting in a coalition with the Labour Party, for example, or other big parties that we have, do you think there's more hope in terms of climate, like reform in terms of climate change in Ireland than we might have in the UK? Especially I'm thinking of like the rise of the far right in the UK and how that's affected the Labour Party, because they should be the progressive party, but unfortunately it's not looking that way. So I just wanted your perspective on that. Yeah,
that's a great question. So I'm not a political scientist, but I have lots of opinions about it. So in Ireland, historically, we've been a republic for just over 100 years, and in that 100-year period, two main parties have been in power, either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, so one side or the other. They're both basically centre-right parties, and a coalition of the left never really has been in power in Ireland for different reasons historically as well. So the 2020 election we had, for the first time, there was a real sea change, partly because of the global financial crisis that hit us really badly, and also people felt we needed an absolute change. What we got actually was the two main parties coming together. So it was like the big bromance that nobody thought would ever happen. But they couldn't get the numbers enough, so they got the Greens to go in with them. Arguably, the Greens were very successful in actually enacting a lot of their green policies in Ireland. So in terms of transport, in terms of supporting kind of climate action in communities, rollout of electric vehicles and supports for retrofitting houses and grants for all of that. They accelerated a lot of that, probably much faster than most people thought that they would do. big issues for us in Ireland is farming and agriculture. It's a big part of our economy, and the farmers feel, I think, they're always the bad guys. So I think the tension in Ireland is actually how the farming community has been treated, and maybe not really dealt with, probably in the correct way as well, in bringing that on board and supporting farmers enough as well. And so that would be the big difference in Ireland, I think. But I think I have no idea what's going to happen in a week's time. It will be Friday week. We'll have our elections, so I'll come back to you after that. Yeah. But it's interesting that, generally speaking, the concern is that if the Greens won't get into power, which they probably won't get into power, the concern is that the Green agenda will slip. And that's the big concern.
Do you think that's likely?
The two big parties will say that they are climate conscious and that they are doing this, but things are already starting to slip in terms of what they're saying their programme for government would be if they get into power again. But that's not just in Ireland, that's in Europe as well. And so the last 5 or 6 years of EU policy was on a Green New Deal and on sustainability. But in the last number of years, that has shifted towards a real concern about securitisation, very understandably because of what has happened in Europe on our doorstep. But the concern now is if the focus is going to go on securitisation, where is the green agenda in Europe then as well? And it comes back to that question that it has to be legislation, and financial repercussions is really what motivates governments to change. But also from the ground up, that there's the tipping point of what social scientists talk about, the Overton window. That communities and that general populace often can be ahead of governments, and governments are too afraid to jump, but that people are already ahead of it, and that they will only jump then after, once they see they'll have the majority population behind them. We had that in Ireland with 2 referendas recently on, we were the first country in the world to legislate by popular vote for single-sex marriage, and then we had then our abortion referendum then more recently as well. So Ireland has moved in a way that has been more left of centre in terms of a general population, but we'll see how things shift now in a week's time. So, yeah, fingers crossed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I had a few answers maybe before I throw you a question, because I worked on other novels by Stanley Robinson. Yeah. And so I know I've heard him talk about why Mary Robinson as an inspiration. I can't for the life of me remember exactly the reason, but it was something that he's talked about and said it was very deliberate. I think Mary said that you could understand why it was a woman, and I think what's really interesting about Stanley Robinson, he has a lot of women protagonists. And one of the interesting things about his life is that his wife is a microbiologist, and he's moved also with her to follow her academic career. He had a career as a writer, but he was the stay-at-home dad, and he's been consistently advocating for women's voices and women's role in life. I know when asked questions about Malthusianism and the population problem, he's consistently brushed it away, saying that one of the easiest ways actually to reduce population was to give women rights, because because that's factually how it works, but also that the population problem is not so much a population problem as a resource optimization problem. And I think what you said also that was that really made me think was, let me find my notes, I'm lost again. You talked about science fiction and maybe all this discourse about hope, this idea that maybe the apocalypse is a very enticing topic for fiction, and that there's not so much fiction that focuses on other future alternatives. I know that at least in French science fiction and a little bit in American science fiction too, this is a discourse that's been happening a lot, and there's a lot of conversation on how maybe that's something that's the role of science fiction, of climate fiction in particular. There's a league of climate fiction writers in the US that has a monthly newsletter that tries to focus on that. And I know that's something that I am excited to explore and that maybe would be interesting for you too.
Great.
I was wondering, you were talking about Ireland specifically, which is not a country I know a lot about because I focus on the US. And the absence maybe of hope in Irish literature. Maybe this is a question that doesn't have an easy answer, but is there maybe more hope in the literature of the Irish diaspora, or is this literature still very much focused on this double time of the past and the present rather than the present and the future? What would you...
I think, and Marie will have some thoughts on this, I'm sure too. I think at the moment in Ireland, so we've just come through what's called a decade of commemoration. So from 1913 to 1923, it was kind of called the revolutionary decade in Ireland. So it was setting up different events that happened socially, culturally and politically that led then to Irish independence. And we've just come through the centenary of commemorating that decade. And I think the impact of that, and then that happening in kind of the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which Ireland was disproportionately affected by, really brought a lot of soul searching about what is the Republic, what is the future, what was history, what was all this for, if we had to get the EU, IMF, Troika to bail us out, is Ireland cancelled, like all of these discussions were there. So there was a lot of soul searching over the last kind of 15, 20 years. I think writers were kind of working their way through that, and so while that was kind of at a big macro level, the kind of the national question and our kind of colonial history, and then, you know, have we grown up enough to manage ourselves, this kind of rhetoric, which is a very kind of colonial idea still of a post-colonial or decolonising nation. And I think now what's happening is it's happening at a sub-national level, so looking at other stories and other histories. So the Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, questions of sexual abuse and exploitation, other kinds of deep, dark histories in Ireland we're only now coming to terms with. So I think we're just now in a process of healing, and I think writers are particularly involved in that process at the moment, and have been writing about that really well. And there's a movie coming out now, Small Things Like These, with Claire Keegan, film that's out, that's getting huge accolades for a very quiet, small novel that deals the very big question about dark secrets in Irish culture. And we're now just coming to terms with all of these kinds of questions, I think. And I think we are moving in that direction, I think, in a way, and also allowing ourselves then other kinds of freedoms. And I would say definitely different kinds of genres of a younger generation not interested in the past. So the Sally Rooney generation and what she's writing and the impact of her has been extraordinary. And then young adult fiction in Ireland has been extraordinary as well too. So again, moving beyond the traditional kinds of literary kind of production that Ireland has won 4 Nobel Prizes for, etc., etc. It's moving in other exciting directions now, I think.
Yeah, and also your question about the diaspora. And the diaspora, the recent diaspora, is not very existent. I mean, it's not very powerful because there's such a young generation, numerous generation of Irish writers who are in Ireland. But if I and writing from Ireland, I mean, because emigration is not so much in fashion now as it used to be. But I'm thinking of Colin McCann, who is not an immigrant, or because he was more of an expatriate in that sense, you know, traveller, and then he settled in the US, but not for economic or religious reasons. And he is a writer of hope. I mean, he's been writing about hope forever, really, and you know, drawing links between periods, between countries, between people. I mean, that is his main subject, and the organisation that he founded 10 years ago, Narrative 4. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. No, it's Narrative. It's for people, and it's for you, and it's really an organisation that promotes empathy by sharing stories. So you share a story. Let's say I share my story with a story on any topic with you, and you share your story with me. And then in face of the group, I will say, well, I don't know your name, but let's say it's with Libby. Hello, my name is Libby, and I will tell the story that Libby told me, saying I, and vice versa. And everything in his fiction is about this kind of links, about this kind of exchanges and stepping into somebody else's shoes. That's his big idea. Because if you are able to do that, then the world is a better place to live. So that all comes back to hope in a way, you know. So I'd say, yeah, Colin McCann, if he epitomizes hopeful Irish diaspora, let's say. But at the moment, he's already in his 60s or almost in his 60s. He's not a young Irish writer, and most young Irish writers are in Ireland at the moment. Yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much. It was fascinating. I said I'd keep a low profile, but I always have a question. I was just wondering, kind of bouncing back on some of the themes you've been talking about together with Marie, and also the question we had over here about a literature of hope, and particularly in the context of Ireland. As a novel which has obviously been very heavily promoted because it won the Booker Prize, Paul Lynch's Prophet Song. I was just wondering how one would situate that in some of these ideas in terms of it being a novel which is not about climate change as such, but it's a novel about societal collapse. It's a heavily dystopian fiction. It's not very hopeful, but it doesn't seem to look back to the past, because you were talking about this idea of Irish literature perhaps sort of struggling to escape the kind of the phantoms of the past. I mean, you could see it, I suppose, as a kind of a reimagining of the kind of sectarian crisis that happened during the Troubles, but sort of projected onto a future, or you could see it as something completely fresh, I suppose, as a very pessimistic vision of the future. But I just wondered if either of you had any thoughts about how that novel kind of fits in with some of the things you've been talking about.
No, absolutely, and it's a great observation. I think you can read it in different ways. You could read it as a novel about the future, but you can also read it a novel of the logic of the past as well, too, that this is a logical outcome of a particular kind of vision of a particular society that has undergone and still it's certain parts of the history of the novel are unclear, like it's unclear in certain points what's actually happened or what are the levers exactly behind all of this, but looking at kind of the question of an authoritarian regime. But also it's kind of a bit of a warning flare, I think, as well, too. In Ireland, we don't have the same history of the rise of the far right as other countries have had in Europe, and it's only in recent years that has become an issue. And last year we had the first really big public riots, which were known now as the Dublin riots, where the inner city became basically impassable and had to shut down. Trains, buses and police cars were set on fire, and as a response to an attack on a child that was seen in terms of a racial context, that was then taken out of complete.
I mean, the novel would have been written before that.
It was written before that. So, but there was also, prior to COVID, there were just little hints of that kind of feeling in Ireland as well, that then literally accelerated in the last number of years. So I think what he's kind of doing is getting the temperature of those kinds of things, looking at a history of a very particular history of politics, of a particular vision of Ireland, and then projecting that into a future that could happen, that hopefully won't. But that novel actually has accelerated discussions about what kind of Ireland do we want to build? What's the Ireland of our future? And what do we need to be mindful of now in terms of rhetoric and language and information and disinformation and demonisation of individuals and communities, that we need to be very, very careful and sensitive towards as well. So it kind of propelled a certain discussion that maybe we might not have had in a particular way. So in terms of a public forum, I think that was quite helpful as well, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think Christine had a question.
Yeah.
To come back, thank you for your fascinating talk. First, I was really struck by the fact that you said that it seems that there is a problem with the very genre of the novel. And if I remember right, I haven't read the book yet, and I should, and we all should, because we're working on climate fiction. The Great Derangement by Gosh, where he says that precisely the novel is not appropriate to speak about such themes. And I guess one of his main points is because he speaks about the novel of apprenticeship and this being turned towards the future in a linear way. And I was really struck by this image you had of the steps. And this made me think of a beautiful work that you might have read by Alexis Wright, the Aboriginal Australian writer. And in Carpentaria, precisely, she draws a lot from storytelling in Indigenous Australia and how in their culture, in the dream time, precisely concerning time, past, present, and future are not discernible and they're entangled. And this completely changes their vision, and they have, to that extent, much more espérance insofar as they feel that everything is interconnected and that resilience is always possible. And in the novel, it ends on an ending that can seem at first dystopian, because there is a storm that devastates the whole town. And that, and also I was thinking of this because at one point you spoke about this need for the long-term perspective, the seventh generation, etc. And precisely for a lot of Indigenous Australians, there is this idea that they're a very old culture, 60,000 years old, and that to that extent they have this ingrained in their culture to take their time, to be immersed in the dream time, and to be fully conscious of this intricate links between past, present, and future. And even if there is this storm at the end that destroys the town, this is very much presented as an opportunity, as a sort of springboard for a reinvention, a reimagination of another type of world. And there are two main characters that are named in a way that is very obvious, symbolically speaking: hope and will. And basically the message, the ultimate message, is that with both hope and will, everything is possible. And will ends up on an island that is made of rubbish, that is really the excess produce of overexploitation. But then the rubbish on the sea, they will aggregate themselves and enable a new island to emerge. And then with seeds, with birds, seagulls bringing new seeds, a new island, new life emerges. And it sounds like this is very optimistic, maybe over-optimistic, completely implausible. And then, because there is always irony, and she's not naive either, there is this image that it would have been possible if only the white ants, meaning the private interests and capitalistic society, was on there to have the whole island in the end dismantle itself, but leaving it ambiguous whether maybe other islands will build and whether we can get rid of the white ants in the end. But I felt that there were a lot of threads that connected to what you said. So
that's great. I'll have to get that reference from you again.
Definitely. I think you'll love that novel.
Yeah, that's great.
It's Alexis Wright's Carpentaria. And also because, and this also connects with what Marie was talking about, and thanks for this fascinating reference to Peluchon's La Mer, l'esprit de la mer. What's the name of the...
L'être et la mer, existentialisme écologique.
Because precisely this is what Alexis Wright does in this book. This is called Carpentaria because this is set in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and the whole geography of the place has been formed and shaped by the ebb and flow of the sea, and the fact that many acres along the shore are regularly flooded. But in their culture, it's not a sign of death. This is just endless renewal. So they have this very positive vision of endless destruction and renewal. And this is part of life, and this is nothing to despair about. This just has to be accepted. And I think we have a lot to learn from this. So I'm pretty sure you'll love the novel.
Yeah. And I like the idea. Oh, that sounds fantastic. Thank you. That hope and will. So again, the idea of action, that you just can't just sit there and think about it.
Exactly.
We have to actually do something as well.
And precisely, and hope. In the end, she will look for her partner, Will, who is lost on one of those islands, drifting islands, and she doesn't even know how to navigate. But she just takes the plunge. And this is really the idea, just take the plunge. Let's all take the plunge, and then things can change.
Great. It's a lesson for us all. Thank you.
Junior?
Thank you so much for this talk. This was really, really interesting. And like I think everyone here, I'm really interested in this idea of hope and like optimism as well, and like the separation between that. And on the idea that like where has hope gone in that climate fiction? I wonder, this is less of a question, more of a musing. I wonder if maybe there's a sense of irresponsibility with hope and with this idea of like optimism as just like ignoring things for the sake of not feeling dread every day. But I wonder if maybe there's this idea that we haven't earned hope yet, that until we start doing properly radical stuff, and when I say we, I also mean like at government scales, especially with the rise of the far right and with the dismissal of climate change as something serious, if there's a feeling that maybe it's too irresponsible to write about hope right now, and that we can't think about nice things, we have to think about how bad it is, because that's the only thing that's going to spur action. But
well, actually, psychologically speaking, if you only focus on negative elements, this freezes.
I don't think it's. I don't think it's an easy. I don't think it's good to just think about the bad, but I wonder if there's maybe the sense of.
No, I think it's a really important point, and I think it's it kind of struck home to me about 2 years ago. So I teach into different courses across the university, and I was teaching into a master's class, and then one of the students came up to me, and she was just really distressed at the end of it, and I was like, okay, I have to do something different here, because and when you're working through this material, you're thinking about it, and I wasn't talking about hope at the time, and you forget sometimes that it stays with people, and it's a heavy load, and it stays with people in different ways for different reasons. So I was like, okay, I need to do something different. So every time I teach anything to do with the environment now, I always end of the slide. It's really cheesy and corny. My students love it. It's called Nessa's slide from the upside. So it's the cheery bit. So it's like, okay, trigger warning at the beginning, we're talking about going to become extinct. But at the end, we have an opportunity to do something different. And then I had a class about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I forgot to put my slide from the upside up at the end because I was running off to do something else. And all the students came up to me and went, where was your slide from the upside? We're really upset now, we don't have it. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to put it in. I'll put it up then on our digital blackboard thing, So it is there. But it's something that we constantly need to be mindful of. Like you were saying, if you can get sucked into the doom scrolling and the end of the world type stuff, and there's enough of that out there. But as Rebecca Solnit and others say in Slavoj Žižek, we have to keep a space for hope, and we have to work to remind yourself of that sometimes, and that can be tiring as well. But it's really important to remember that, and things can always be different, and that's the reminder as well, and to learn from history about the lessons of history, that things weren't great in the medieval ages, for women, and we can work to make it better, So but it takes energy to do that,
And also, if you remember, Marie, one of the first seminars you organized for the series of Homes seminar, there was a psychologist, and he was so convincing about this idea that the more you terrorize people, the more stupid they become. Because basically, this is only your reptilian brain that gets into that starts working, and what a reptilian brain does is that there is only one solution. It's binary. You fight or you flee. But you're not inventive. You're not creative. You're not constructive. So that's the exact contrary that we should do. And he explained that this is one of the reasons why so many autocratic regimes use terror, because precisely it prevents people.
It's paralyzing. It paralyzes you. Yeah. A great climate scientist, and then we will let everyone go home then. To read is Catherine Hayhoe, H-A-Y-H-E-O-H-O-E. Sorry, Catherine Hayhoe, and her book. I think, do I have it here? Oh yeah, I do. So. Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. She talks exactly about that, Christine, as well. The dangers of scare tactics to shock people into changing their behaviour, to shock a government into moving in a certain direction. That it doesn't work. So she has a different proposition to look at. But she looks at the psychology behind it as well, and different kinds of frames through which you have to engage, and the different kinds of levers that we need to pull to get the positive tipping points to move things. So that's a good one to add. Yeah, no problem. And I'll finish. We had a similar talk like this back in September with colleagues in Limerick, and we ended up actually sharing book references. It was like a little mini book club, and it was really nice. Because it was a way I didn't know this and I didn't know that, and so we ended up sharing just references to kind of help people to make it a bit easier.
I can recommend that also. It's much easier to read The Book of Hope by Jane Goodall, because it's more autobiographical than actual philosophy. Yeah, there's the word hope in the title, as you can notice again. So.
I think we should have
yet another one.
There should be a shelf in every student library with hope, books on hope, I think, for all of us. And we need it for everything.
Yeah, and just one last remark, and we will let everyone leave. It's just, you talked about children's books, and there's loads of children's books with lots of hope. I just read the trilogy by Hannah Gold. I don't know if you know it. Finding the Last Bear, The Lost Whale, Finding Bear. Okay. There's lots of things around, hope. But also talking about all the problems that we have, but at the end it's a happy ending. So I think there's also a lot for children, and you talked about that, rebuilding for the new generation.
And I think children's authors probably realise that very consciously they have to have a space for hope in their books. And I think we can learn a lot from that for sure.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci à vous. Thank you for your patience. I was on Irish time upstairs.